There is a number that almost no one in financial media is discussing right now. It is not the gold price. It is not the 10-year Treasury yield. It is not the dollar index. The number is 29. That is the percentage of outstanding United States government debt currently held by foreign central banks and sovereign investors. In the year 2000, that number was 48. In 2010, it was 42. In 2020, it was 33. And today, in 2026, it is 29 and still falling. I want you to understand what that number represents, because every percentage point of decline in that figure represents hundreds of billions of dollars of structural selling pressure on the asset that underpins the dollar's reserve status. And when the dollar's reserve status is structurally under pressure, there is exactly one asset class in 300 years of recorded monetary history that has absorbed that pressure and converted it into lasting purchasing power. You already know what that asset is. What you may not fully understand yet is the precise mechanism by which the transition is operating, how far along it already is, and what the most important financial decision makers on earth are doing right now, quietly and systematically, before the rest of the market catches on. Let me start with a story that most investors have never been taught to connect to the present moment. In November 1956, the British pound was the world's second reserve currency. Britain's Royal Navy was the largest in the world, and the British Empire still controlled the most critical shipping choke point in the Eastern Hemisphere. When Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal in July of that year, Britain and France coordinated a military intervention. They seized the canal. By every measure of hard power, the operation succeeded within days. And then President Eisenhower made one phone call, not to a general, not to a diplomat, to the International Monetary Fund. He instructed the United States to block an emergency loan that Britain desperately needed to defend the pound sterling from speculative attack. Britain's foreign currency reserves were collapsing. Without that American-backed loan, Britain could not defend its currency peg. It had no choice but to withdraw its forces from Egypt within weeks. The military victory became a financial defeat, and the financial defeat sent one signal to every central bank on earth. Sterling is not backed by a power that can defend its global interests without American permission. And a currency that requires American permission to exist is not a reserve currency. It is a subordinate currency wearing a reserve currency's clothes. That was the Suez moment, not the end of sterling in a single day, but the event that revealed to the investors who were watching the correct indicators that the structural conditions for sterling's decline were already firmly in place. The decline that followed took a decade, but it was made inevitable the afternoon Eisenhower picked up that phone. Now I want to show you why 2026 is the dollar's Suez moment. Not because the dollar will collapse next quarter. Reserve currency transitions do not work that way. What I'm going to show you is how the mechanism that ended sterling's 200-year reign is operating on the dollar right now, in the central bank data, in the Federal Reserve's own balance sheet, in a money supply that grew by $1 trillion in 7 months, and why the investors who understand this sequence are not watching the daily gold price. They are watching something far more important. The analogous event to Eisenhower's phone call happened in February 2022. The United States and its allies froze $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves. Those reserves were held in dollar-denominated assets. They were frozen with a keystroke. No military confrontation required. A purely administrative decision made in Washington vaporized the reserve assets of a major sovereign nation in hours. Every finance minister and every central bank governor in the developing world watched that happen. And they drew the same conclusion that every British financial official drew in November 1956 when Eisenhower blocked the IMF loan. If your reserves can be frozen with a keystroke, they are not really yours. They are a loan from Washington, repayable on demand. What followed was not dramatic. It was methodical. Central banks that had been steady buyers of U.S. treasuries for decades began quietly, consistently, and at historically unprecedented scale, redirecting a portion of their reserve accumulation toward a single asset, an asset that has no counterparty, an asset that cannot be frozen, an asset that cannot be sanctioned, an asset that cannot be devalued by the monetary policy of the country that issued it because no country issued it. Physical gold. Central banks purchased 1,037 tons of gold in 2023, 1,045 tons in 2024, 863 tons in 2025, 3 consecutive years of purchases at roughly double the pre-2022 historical average of 400 to 500 tons annually. This is not diversification. Diversification is a marginal adjustment. 3 consecutive years of double the historical average by the institutions that manage the world's monetary system is a strategic repositioning. And strategic repositioning at this scale has one historical precedent. It is what always happens in the decade before a reserve currency transition completes itself. Now let me show you the 3 structural pressures that make 2026 the specific inflection point, the moment when the underlying forces become impossible to ignore. Because it is not enough to understand the long-term trend. The investor who acts on structural analysis at the right moment captures the full move. The investor who waits for confirmation captures only what is left after the institutions have already positioned. The first pressure is the Iran war and its impact on the petrodollar system. Since 1973, the dollar's reserve status has rested on 2 pillars. United States Treasury bonds as the world's safest store of value, and oil priced in dollars, which means every nation that consumes oil must maintain dollar reserves. The Strait of Hormuz closure attacked both pillars simultaneously. 20% of global oil consumption passes through that strait. With it, commercially disrupted nations facing emergency dollar demand for energy imports at exactly the moment when the dollar's long-term safe haven status is being structurally questioned, face a uniquely painful arithmetic. That combination creates the short-term dollar spike that temporarily suppresses gold, the same mechanical sequence that played out in 1973, while the long-term structural pressure builds underneath it. Invisible to most investors, fully visible in the central bank data. The second pressure is the Federal Reserve's paralysis. At its March 18th meeting, the Fed held rates at 3.5% to 3.75%, while simultaneously acknowledging that oil-driven inflation was moving higher and GDP growth had collapsed to 0.7% in the fourth quarter. That is stagflation, the combination of rising prices and falling growth that the Fed has no clean policy response to. Cut rates to fight the recession and reignite the inflation that oil has already made worse. Hold rates to fight inflation and accelerate the economic slowdown. Raise rates and trigger a fiscal crisis on $39 trillion in debt that already costs $1.03 trillion annually to service. There is no fourth option. The Fed is trapped. And operating in the background of that impossible arithmetic is a program the Federal Reserve began in December 2025 without a press conference, without a formal statement, and without using the words that would accurately describe it. The Fed is purchasing $40 billion per month in Treasury securities under the name Reserve Management Purchases. Powell insists this is not quantitative easing. By every functional definition, it is precisely that. The Fed is creating money from nothing to purchase government debt that the market is not absorbing fast enough at existing prices. That is the definition of debt monetization. And debt monetization, in every historical instance, has had one consistent long-term consequence for the currency of the country that undertakes it. Gold prices it before the central bank admits it, and gold is pricing it now. The third pressure is the private credit system. $3 trillion in largely unregulated, opaque loans made during the zero interest rate era of 2020 to 2022. Major firms are now restricting investor withdrawals. Redemption requests are surging. The losses that have been obscured by what the industry calls amend and extend practices are beginning to surface. When those losses are eventually forced into the open, and the arithmetic of sustained higher rates against heavily leveraged borrowers makes that eventual outcome a mathematical certainty, they will flow into the banking system. And the institution that will be asked to backstop that system is the Federal Reserve, using the same tool it has already deployed at $40 billion per month under a name nobody is supposed to notice. Now, let me close with what the investors who understand this sequence are actually watching. Because the most dangerous mistake in a reserve currency transition is to watch the wrong indicators. The first indicator is the dollar index, the DXY. It is currently elevated, mechanically supported by the emergency dollar demand created by the Hormuz closure and the oil shock it produced. That support is temporary. It is tied to a specific geopolitical event with a finite duration. When oil stabilizes, when alternative supply routes absorb enough of the Hormuz disruption, the emergency dollar demand diminishes. When the DXY breaks back below 97, the primary mechanical headwind on gold prices reverses. Watch the DXY, not the headline oil price, not the war news, the DXY. The second indicator is the 10-year Treasury yield, currently at 4.25%. The United States is refinancing $9.2 trillion in debt this fiscal year. At current rates, the annual interest cost on that refinancing is $391 billion more than it would have been at 2% rates. That arithmetic is not indefinitely sustainable against a $39 trillion total debt load the moment that arithmetic forces a policy response, a rate cut, open quantitative easing, a form of yield curve control. The 10-year yield breaks below 3.5%. And when it does, the mechanical case for institutional rotation from treasuries into gold becomes mathematically compelling. Watch the 10-year yield, not the gold price. The yield tells you when the mechanism is turning. The British pound had its Suez moment in November 1956. The investors who understood what that moment meant did not panic. They did not watch the daily exchange rate. They repositioned steadily and patiently toward assets whose value was independent of any single government's ability to manage its finances. And in the decade that followed, the structural move that the Suez moment had made inevitable delivered exactly what historical monetary transitions always deliver to the investors who understood the mechanism before it became obvious. The dollar is having its Suez moment now. The 29% figure is not a prediction. It is a measurement. The central bank gold data is not a forecast. It is a record of decisions already made by the most sophisticated sovereign capital allocators on Earth. The money supply data is not a theory. It is arithmetic. $1 trillion created in 7 months. 30% of all dollars in American history created since 2020. The structural conditions that drive reserve currency transitions do not announce themselves in press conferences. They reveal themselves in data. That data is already here. Most investors have no idea what it means. Now you do.